In the last video, we talked all about the event loop, and it was definitely confusing. So luckily in this video, we have a much more simple topic, which is the idea of event delegation. So on my index.html, I just have these four separate buttons labeled button 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can see them on the right-hand side here. And right now I have this script tag that doesn't really do anything, but let's make it so when we click on one of these buttons, it just prints out the text clicked. So we can just get all of our buttons by doing a document.query selector all for button. And here I just want to do buttons.for each one of my buttons. I just want to do a event listener, so button.add event listener on the click event. And in here we can just say console.log clicked button. There we go. Now if I click a button, doesn't matter which one, it's going to print out this clicked button text. And that works great. This is how we've been doing this in the entirety of this course. But there's something interesting that happens when we do a click event listener, or really any event listener for that matter. And that's that this actually bubbles up. This is delegated up and down the different event tree. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. Let's create another event listener on our body. And we're going to create another further event listener on our document as a whole. So let's just come down here. We can say document.body.add event listener of click. And here we can just say console.log clicked body. I'm just going to copy this completely, come up here. We're just going to do document.add event listener click, and this is going to say clicked document. Okay, so now if we click on one of our buttons, what do you expect to happen? You probably expect it to log out clicked button. But you notice it actually prints out clicked button, clicked body, and clicked document. Now if I click somewhere over here just on the body, you'll see it prints out clicked body and clicked document. But why is that? I clicked on just the button. Why is it printing out the body and the document as well? Well, what happens is that this click event actually just kind of pierces through everything. So we clicked our button, and behind our button, we had our body. And behind our body, we had our document. And it just goes on and on and on until it gets all the way to the end where there's nothing else behind it. In our case, document is our last event listener here, so there's nothing else further behind it. So it says, okay, I clicked on all of these different things. If we actually inspect our page here, go to the Elements tab, I just make this a little bigger, you can kind of see that. So when I click on this button here, it goes to the next thing behind it, which is our body. And behind that, we have our document, which is our HTML here. We just kind of go all the way up the tree until we get all the different things that we're clicking on. And in JavaScript, what actually happens is the opposite. It says, okay, what is the furthest back thing you clicked? In our case, our document. And then it goes to the next furthest back thing, which is our body. And then the next furthest back thing, which is our button, which in our case is the final thing. So it's kind of going backwards in that order. It goes from the document all the way down to the body, then down to the button. And then what happens is it runs those events in order from the one that's closest to you to the one that's farthest. That's why it prints out button first, then body, then document. And this process encapsulates delegation, capturing, and bubbling. So delegation essentially means that your events are delegated to all different things that get clicked. So our button is not the only thing that actually handles our click, it's everything else that gets clicked in the chain. For example, our document and our document body also have that event delegated to them. Then what happens with capturing is that first stage where we go through our different elements from the very outermost one, our document, downward into our body and downward to our button. That's capturing, where we go from the furthest away thing to the closest thing, one by one in order. So we go document, then body, then buttons. That is that capturing phase. Then the next thing that happens is called bubbling, which is where you start at the innermost thing and your event bubbles upward. So we start in the button, then we bubble up to the body, and then we bubble up one step further to the actual document itself. And this is where your code is by default going to run their events. They run them in the bubble phase, where you go from the very closest thing to the very furthest away thing. What happens if we actually want to change that behavior? Well, this add event listener takes another property, and this property is a set of options. Let's just come in here. We can create that option object, and we can create this capture object, which by default is set to false. This essentially determines, do we run this event in the capture phase, which we remember is when we go from furthest out to the closest to you. By default, this is false because we run in the bubble phase, which is where we go from closest all the way out to furthest, essentially reverse order. If we change capture to true, then what's going to happen is our events are going to run in that capture phase. So what's going to happen with this is we run our document event here for button clicked. This is our capture phase. So we say, okay, we clicked the button, or we clicked our document, and it says, okay, this is happening in the bubble phase because capture is false. So we ignore this. Then it goes to the body and it says, hey, this is in the capture phase and this capture sets to true. So it's going to log out clicked body. Then it's going to get to our button during the capture phase, do nothing. Then we're going to bubble upwards. So we're going to print out clicked button because it's in the bubble phase, get to here, which we already ran in the capture phase, so we skip it, and then it's going to print clicked document. So if I save this and I click on button 4, you're going to notice it goes clicked body, clicked button, clicked document. And that's because this event listener for our body is running inside the capture phase, which is the first thing that happens where we go from outside to inside. So it's going from the top down to the very bottom, that's capture. And then we're going from that inside of our button all the way to the outside of our document in the bubble. And that's where the clicked button and clicked document run. If we changed all of these to be capture true, let's just copy this down. Oops. Copy this down here as well. Now what's going to happen when I click a button is you're going to notice it goes document, then body, then button. That's because all these are set to run in the capture phase. And that's what happens when you start with the outermost element and work your way to the innermost element. Another thing that's really interesting is what happens if we don't want this delegation to happen. For example, if we click on our button, we don't want to delegate this to our body and to our document. Let's remove these capture phases here just to go back to a normal default button. Click. And here we go. If we click, it'll go button, body, document. We want it to only print out button and nothing else. What we can do is we can take that event argument here, and we can say event dot stop propagation. And what this does is it says immediately what I want you to do is not propagate to any of these other things that are going to happen. So we go through the capture phase, nothing runs. Then when we're bubbling, we run this button event click listener, and it says, don't bubble this up to anything else, just stop where you are. So now if we click a button, you're going to notice it doesn't bubble up any further. And if we click on our body, this still bubbles up because we don't actually have the bubble, stopping the propagation inside the body. If we put this inside of here and didn't have it inside of our button, now when we click a button, of course we need to make sure we have that reference to our event here. But now when we click our button, it says clicked button, clicked body, and this is stopping the propagation, so it never goes up to this document level. This also works exactly the same way with capture. So we could just change this to be capture true. And now you're going to notice that when we click a button, it only prints out clicked body, because what happens is we're in the capture phase. So we go to our document, which runs in the bubble phase, so we just skip it. Then we get to our body, which is running in the capture phase. It's saying stop propagation and then printing out clicked body. So it doesn't actually propagate to anything else. We just kind of stop our capture there. And if we stop our capture, then we also don't do the bubble because we stopped everything prematurely. So once we get to this body, we're stopping propagation, so we don't even get to capture the button click. And then of course, we don't actually get to bubble back out anywhere because we just stopped that completely. Now, it's not super important to know all the nuances of how capturing and delegation and bubbling work. The important thing to understand though is that when you do click on a button or anything on your page or fire any event listener for that matter, by default, these events are going to be captured and bubbled, starting with capturing from the outside to the inside and then bubbling up from the inside to the outside. And by default, everything is going to run in the bubble phase. So it's going to start with the closest event, in our case, our button, and work its way upward through all of the events until it gets further and further out. For example, button, then body, then document. That's the default behavior of these events. And this is really great because we can actually use this to make it so that we can have click event listeners on elements that are new to the page. So let's say, for example, just get rid of all of this code that we have here. And all we want to do is create a new button. So we can just say const new button equals document.create element button. Then we can just say document.body.append new button. Let's just make sure we give it some text. So we'll say new button.inner text is equal to button 5. There we go. We have a new button added to our page. And up here, if we were to do buttons.for each button, we do button.add event listener on click. And we do this here where we just print out console.log click button. There we go. When we click a button, it prints it out. But you'll notice when we click button 5, it doesn't actually print anything. The reason for that is we queried our buttons, then we did our for each for them. We added our event listener where we click on the button, and then we added a new button to the page. And even though it matches this query selector up here, we already did the query. So this button didn't exist at that time. We don't have a reference to it. This is a very common problem. What you would need to do is say new button.add event listener on click. You need to write out that event listener. We could copy this in here. And now if we click button 5, it'll print it out. But this is kind of cumbersome. It's really easy to make mistakes when we're doing this. So what we can do instead is take advantage of this delegation of events. So let's just scrap out this here And instead, we're going to write something that takes advantage of delegation. We can just add an event listener on our document. This is going to always fire because anywhere we click on our page is going to be clicking on our document. Whether it's button 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, all of them also click on the document. We can add an event listener on click. What we want to do inside of here is just get our event itself. And let's just say console.log e.target. This e.target is the thing that we clicked on. So now if I click button 1, you'll notice e.target is button 1. If I click button 5, e.target is button 5. We got our click event listener to work, even though we added this button afterwards. We don't even need this selector up here. We can just get rid of that. Now you can see we're printing out the elements we click on. If we click here, we're getting our body because that's our body we're clicking on. So it's working for everything on our page, but we only want this to work when we click on a button, not when we click on our body. So what we can do is we can say e.target.matches. This is a function that takes any CSS selector. It works exactly the same as query selector and query selector all, and you pass it a CSS selector, and if the element you are selecting, our e.target, matches the selector, then it returns true, otherwise it returns false. We could say button, does this match the button selector? If so, then we want to do a console.log of clicked button. So now it's save, click button 1, get the text, button 3 works, button 5 works. If we click our body, you notice it doesn't actually print this out. As you can see, I'm clicking and nothing is getting printed, but all of these buttons do work. So this e.target just allows us to match any CSS selector. We could go a step further and add a class to one of these. Let's just say class equals cool. And now in here, we could just say if it matches the class cool, then it's going to print. And as you can see, when we get to button 3, which is the one we added that class to right here, it'll work. And none of these other buttons will, or the body, because none of them have that CSS selector. This is a really common way when you're dynamically adding elements like this to your page to just make sure that they always work by just adding an event listener on the document, waiting for it to bubble up to the document, and checking to see if it matches the specific element you're looking for, and then run your event listener. And that's all there is to event delegation. In the next video, we're going to be talking about how you can store data inside of a user's browser, which is super useful for tons of different applications, so I can't wait to see you in that video.